$7.9 trillion. That was the historically adjusted market capitalization of the Dutch East India Trading Company. It was a for-profit company larger and more powerful than most of history's greatest empires. If it was around today, the world's first multinational corporation would have been worth more than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and still have more than enough money left over to purchase McDonald's, Walmart, and Samsung. Most companies would be lucky to last 10 years, but the VOC ruled early global trade for nearly 2 centuries, from 1602 until 1799, with an impact that still continues today thanks to its radical business innovations and questionable behavior. But its biggest contribution to the world, if we ignore all the killing, invading, and enslaving, are shareholders. Besides pioneering corporate governance, the creation of shareholders paved the way for modern businesses to become more accessible to the average person. This helped popularize employee welfare like healthcare and pensions, and introduced insurance bonds and joint stock ownership. So, who were the people that owned the most valuable company of all time? How did the concept of a corporation even start? And how did the Board of Investors influence the direction of world history? Chapter 1. Corporate Pirates. The official name was Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. If any Dutch speakers take issue with my pronunciation, please don't throw your clogs at me. For the sake of convenience, we'll use the simple abbreviation of VOC. The VOC was created by the Dutch government through the States General of the Netherlands. The aim? Compete with European powers in the spice trade. From the 1500s to the 17th century, the Western world expanded with the Age of Discovery. Spice routes were big bucks. Empire was big business. Weakening the economy of your rivals would enable you to expand your nation's franchise and monopolize the world before they did. But how do you create a business machine big enough to squeeze the likes of Britain and Portugal out of the new trade routes? To us, the answer is obvious. But in 1602, the solution was revolutionary. Several smaller, competing trade companies were forced to get along under a new name and mission. These pre-companies included businesses which had been sending ships to Asia for at least a decade. They had the experience and skills to fulfill their patriotic duties. They also had special protections. 21 years of monopoly were granted to this new consolidation in a strategic move to stem the tide of infighting. Along with this greater efficiency and profitability came resources to streamline expansions, like quasi-governmental powers. This gave the VOC power to negotiate treaties, wage war, establish colonies, trade posts, and even execute prisoners. All they needed was to secure a foothold in Asia. Then they'd solidify trade relationships, negotiate for best prices, and if need be, have proxy wars with other nations. But how do you fund a business plan this ambitious? The country needed to fend for itself against its imperialistic neighbors, but it'd be a risk to dump all their money into it, especially since seeing any profit would require a lot of time and nautical miles and pirate encounters. Someone had to be the one to come up with the first ever idea for structuring a multinational. Not an easy feat in those days when the fastest form of long-distance communication was a homing pigeon carrying parchment or a guy riding a donkey. Well, it's time to learn how history works as we charter the course of history and discover the world's first shareholders. This week's lesson is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is an educational platform designed for comprehending what you learn. It focuses on a bottom-up learning strategy, starting with the fundamentals using interactive problem-solving activities. Learning and retaining knowledge like this is shown to be 6 times more effective than traditional video lectures. The courses available on Brilliant are carefully crafted by world-class educators, scholars, and professionals from leading organizations and institutions such as MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, and more. Want to know how ChatGPT works? Brilliant offers a wide range of excellent courses on artificial intelligence, including a course called How LLMs Work. This course is an immersive AI workshop that lets you experience and harness the mechanics of today's most advanced tools, getting hands-on experience with real language models as you explore how they work. With Brilliant, learning is accessible from anywhere using a computer, smartphone, or tablet. Brilliant provides opportunities to acquire real knowledge in just a few minutes each day with its captivating and enjoyable lessons, seamlessly integrating into your schedule whenever you have time. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/howhistoryworks or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off your annual premium subscription. Chapter 2. 7 C's and 2 tiers. Funding for the VOC was divided between 2 tiers of shareholders. Of course, they didn't call them shareholders back then. Instead, they called them bevinhebbers and participanten. I know that sounds like a fancy brand of aspirin medication, but they were simply names for governors and ordinary investors. How much money you put in decided how much responsibility you had. It was a bold innovation which laid the groundwork for the two-tier system which we see today, like the dual-class share structures found in Google and Facebook. The governors were usually established merchants. A substantial investment bought them the right to be a part of the decision-making process, which would have been vital given their own experience with trading in boats. Their influence required access to the company's details, like bookkeeping. By comparison, ordinary investors got an ordinary return for their ordinary input. Voting rights weren't given. Company details remained mysterious. Even if you could have a say in decision-making, it would have been worthless without an insight into the company's inner workings. But that's what these people wanted. Like a limited partner in a modern investment firm, all you want is profit. You give your money to help someone else figure out all the hard stuff. On paper, this setup looks like a match made in heaven. Yet, as any modern business-minded person knows, shareholders are sometimes at odds with management. The early days of the VOC were no different. Easily, the most significant case was the Dutch entrepreneur Isaac Lemaire. Not only did his fights with the VOC lead to eventual reformations between shareholders and business owners, it even led to discoveries. As a hugely wealthy merchant, he started out as the largest shareholder in the VOC. In the end, one of his 22 children became the VOC's chief of Dejima in Japan. And yes, you heard that right. 22 kids. Guess old Isaac also wanted an investment return on his gene pool. Anyway, his fight with the VOC started soon after his own merchant trade was merged with the Dutch government's monopoly project. He expressed his concern that the company's board only had company employees on it. He saw how the company's debt reduced shareholder profit. He noticed how the board was deaf to feedback. He observed how the bigwigs were becoming richer. Then he accused one of the company's ship captains of malpractice, and the company directors of manipulating share price. In retaliation, they accused him of embezzling funds and hiding receipts. Litigation ensued. Isaac lost. He was kicked out of the VOC and banned from trading. However, Isaac got his own back by setting up a rival trading company outside the VOC's jurisdiction. Then, his son Jacob discovered alternative trade routes around Cape Horn. This passage was humbly named Lemaire Strait. It didn't dismantle the VOC like they had hoped, but it did remain an important maritime route until the opening of the Panama Canal. And it highlighted that the VOC wasn't as all-powerful as it thought it was. But Isaac's real legacy was in setting a precedent for shareholder rights. By becoming the first corporate activist, Isaac's drama highlighted a need for big business structures to increase transparency and accountability. This was going to be vital when the VOC's expansion ushered in another radical business structure. Chapter 3. Charting the Chambers. After Isaac's activism efforts, discussions of autonomy and accountability spread across VOC's network. Different cities had its own chamber. Think of these like different offices of the same law firm. By breaking up different regions into chambers, it created a degree of decentralization which allowed for greater efficiency in resource management. 6 chambers existed in total: Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Delft, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, and Zeeland, which is now known as Middelburg. Each chamber had its own fleet, warehouse, personnel, and governor. Like our modern law firm example, these governors could exert influence over their specific chambers while adhering to overall policies set by the VOC's central board. Like a law firm, investors bought shares in specific chambers rather than the VOC in general, so returns were based on the profits of that specific chamber. The good thing about this is it incentivized shareholders to make their chambers as efficient as possible. But the downside was your chamber's level of profit could ultimately be affected by elements outside your control. Maybe your chosen chamber simply didn't have the best geography to facilitate trade, or there was a local labor shortage. Maybe you had worse weather or a disease outbreak. Needless to say, not all chambers were built equal. Amsterdam was the real moneymaker. It was responsible for half of the initial capital raised. Zeeland was the second most important, with the other fleets being further down the hierarchy. However, they could still have influence over bigger chambers. Representatives from each chamber would meet regularly as part of the Heeren 17. Here, they worked to coordinate efforts by formulating and enforcing policies in what was the 1600s version of a co-op. The exception is they prioritized profit over member welfare and distribution of power. Usually in a co-op, every shareholder has one vote, regardless of the level of investment, but the VOC chambers were influenced proportionally. In theory, an early investor in Amsterdam could use their bigger returns to leapfrog an early investor in a small chamber. But to prevent this going out of control, a new system was brought in whereby normal citizens could get a slice of the pie. Chapter 4. Harboring Wealth. Attracting a diverse investment base was vital for growth. Wealthy merchants were instrumental as early backers, but finding ways to bring in average people would transform the already innovative business into something more sustainable and progressive. Investing was open for all, and it didn't matter if you were a small trader, an artisan, or even a domestic servant. Take Neeltje Cornelia. She was the housemaid of Dirk van O, an early investor in the VOC. For a whole month in 1602, she witnessed her employer doing dealings with the other company directors, including our friend Isaac Lemaire. Naturally, she was intrigued. It turns out Dirk van O was raising the capital for the entire Dutch East India Company by selling its stakes to interested parties. But this once-in-a-history opportunity had a deadline. The bookkeeper had to finalize the ledger of capital raising by midnight of the final day of the month. Neeltje thought about it for days, but she didn't know the first thing about business. But she didn't need to. As a housemaid, she knew an awful lot about people, so when she saw how other people were behaving, she knew something big was about to happen. As the clock hands neared 12, the bookkeeper heard a knock at the door. The old woman had come to invest 100 guilders into the world's first IPO. How much is 100 guilders, you ask? Well, exchanging that amount into modern dollars is not simple. So let's just say that if her wages were 50 cents a day, then it was more than likely her life savings. The bookkeeper realized he could give his own servant a bonus with a stake in the VOC. He put her down for 50 guilders 5 minutes before midnight. So how much did the housemaid earn? Well, the VOC's initial pool of capital was 3,674,945 guilders. Neeltje had put down 100, which means that she owned less than 0.001% of the company. But that amount of a $7.2 trillion business lands you just under $196 million. You could say this housemaid really cleaned up. But even if she didn't have the money to put down at the final moment, she could have used another innovation. An option to pay in installments were offered to investors who couldn't buy stock straight away. In essence, a person could pledge an investment which they paid off over time. These payment options helped attract a broader investor base. Company expansions were streamlined and the finances were more stable. With the emergence of a modern equity market, other ventures would soon take notice, which led to the groundwork we have today. However, this buy now, pay later model wasn't a one-size-fits-all. Forget a firm or Klarna, where you can pay over 12 months for those shoes that you probably can't afford. Details had to be hashed out between the bookkeepers and investors. Each installment had a payment deadline, but failing to keep up your end of the deal had possible fallouts. The first is you lose your rights for the future shares reserved for you. Other investors deemed more reliable could snap those up so the company could make ends meet, thereby capping your lucrative investment. But the more devastating punishment was losing rights to the shares you already paid for. You'd no longer be entitled to the upside and dividends of the shares that you'd cleared. Your only choice was to beg for forgiveness, work out a new repayment plan, or watch debt collectors carry out your furniture. More than likely, you'd just have the money that you paid refunded. But that would sting, knowing a missed payment was how you lost out on generational wealth. But the social cost could be much more. Once word got round that you defaulted on a payment, your reputation would be tarnished. Merchants and other businesses would be less inclined to work with someone who couldn't keep up their end of the deal. It's not like you could just pack up and move to a city so easily, or head on down to the unemployment office to get your resume out there. That's why some of the buy now pay later investors sold their stock when they saw financial trouble ahead. The first guy to do this was Jan Allerts. He knew he was heading for a rough patch but couldn't find a way out, so on the 3rd of March 1603, he became the first shareholder to sell the rights to his shares. 2,400 guilders went to Maria van Egmont, and a further 600 went to Mrs. van Barosum. The good news was the shares had risen in value since he first bought them. So though he missed out on the big bucks at the end of his investment, he was able to make a nice little profit on his sale. Active stock trading had just been invented. Of course, people sold their stocks when they had an immediate debt to pay. Like when someone on Facebook Marketplace sells a recently bought PS5 because the rent is due. However, Jan Allerts proved that trading stocks for profit wasn't a bad way to go. From then on, shares were swapped in St. Olaf's Chapel or on a bridge by the harbor, right next to market stalls selling meats and grain. Things picked up so much that a few years later, in August of 1611, Amsterdam opened the world's first stock exchange. This new building might not have been a stock exchange in the way we would imagine one in our time, but it opened the doors to a new way to make money from investing. And a new way to make money always changes how business is done. Chapter 5. Treasuries and Treacheries. By the mid-17th century, the stock exchange had become a sophisticated fixture of every financial landscape. Other countries and cities took note of this revolutionary centralized market and set up their own exchanges. London and Paris followed suit, which enabled their local businesses to raise funds faster and more efficiently. Some of the early practices are still around, like buying and selling based on market fluctuations and even the establishment of a regulatory framework. Now investors could diversify their portfolio. You could even become a stock trader if you had the experience, or lack of experience. But growth like this doesn't come without issues. Tension between governors and ordinary investors never fully went away, and the monopolistic nature of the VOC meant there was a limit to the influence shareholders had on its structure and direction. And as the competition continued with Britain's trading company, plus ongoing issues with smuggling and piracy, the VOC did what every company does when it gets too big. It took on too much debt. In the end, debt was being used to finance its vast operations. Perhaps it would have had better luck funding the extensive military and trading network if the executives at the top hadn't been more interested in lining their pockets. Instead, the multinational was plagued with mismanagement, inefficiency, and sluggishness. Its bureaucracy had once been its greatest strength, but now it was its biggest liability. The good thing about being a small company is your nimbleness allows you to react to market trends quickly. But the VOC was too big of a ship to turn around when the tides turned. Trading spices was the cornerstone of the VOC's vast wealth, but now this sector was crashing. The goods were oversupplied and other trading companies were offering better deals. Plus, consumers were losing interest. They had become more interested in the commodities that the VOC's trade routes didn't carry, like cotton and sugar. It's ironic. The money the VOC generated was used by investors to develop industries that led to its undoing. Textiles were becoming the next big thing. The Industrial Revolution wasn't far off. It also didn't help that France had invaded and set up a puppet government. After 200 years as a multinational pioneer, the Dutch East India Company was turning hollow. The doors were officially closed in 1799, 3 years after the Dutch company stepped in to stabilize the situation. Once it was dissolved, the remaining assets were nationalized, including its debt and colonial administration. Perhaps executives blamed external factors, like the Dutch-Anglo Wars. These encounters did cripple the VOC's naval power and trade routes, and the new political allegiances formed through the century did encourage trade through other means. But really, the VOC's downfall was caused by the thing that created its rise: investors. Everyday consumers decide where to spend their cash. If they don't want to give it to you, they'll give it to your competitor. That means that shareholders and customers were in charge all along. They just didn't know it. Or did they? Do shareholders have as much power as corporations say they have, or is it just a ploy so suits can call the shot? Explain your argument in the comments below. And if you like this video, make sure to check out our video on the history of hedge funds. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.